So, hello, welcome to the American Writers podcast. In this episode, I am going to begin talking about Jeremy Zallen's nonfiction history book, American Lucifers, The Dark History of Artificial Light, 1750 to 1865. And I'll probably spend 2 or 3 episodes talking about this. It's a nice length. It's like the length of a lot of academic books these days, somewhere between 250 and 300 pages. I find more and more books kind of fit in that length, and which is a nice, digestible length. It's not one of those big tomes you sometimes see, or those big biographies you read that go on with too much detail. This book covers a lot of history and covers a lot of themes in history. It actually comes at it from various perspectives. One thing I really appreciate about this book, American Lucifers, is on one level you read it and you kind of think, well, this is a technological history. This is a history of the technology of light, right? And if you were to read books about light in the 1990s, early 2000s, the history would be like, well, you had baby gaslight and sperm whale oil lights early on, and then we get electricity sometime after the Civil War and the Industrial Era, and then we get the electrification of cities, and we get electrical light, and that's kind of the end of the story, right? And I think what Zallen does really well here is doesn't ignore the technological history of it, but he really gets into the pre-electrical period better than I think anyone else. And he does it by not focusing solely on the technology, although you get technological history, you get the history of how things get made, the technology, like how matches were made, how those what he calls piney light, the camphene, basically it was like turpentine lights, how they worked and how they were refilled and how they were sold and distributed. You get a bit of that, but if you're looking for a technological history of that, that's not really the point he's trying to make. The title is American Lucifers, so his interest is in the light bringers. His interest is in those who create light. So it's a labor history to a certain degree, but it's also environmental history. In fact, that's how I came across this book, is I did a online course on environmental history, and this was in the bibliography. So actually a lot of the books I've been reading lately are going to be environmental histories because I've been collecting those books and starting to read them. So it's a little bit of technology, a whole lot of labor history, and also a lot of environmental history, because the interrelation of light and how light was made, the technology of light, such as the material conditions of creating light, whether it's extracting whale oil from the sea, or extracting turpentine from pine trees, or extracting it from gas from coal mines, or today extracting electricity from coal or nuclear power or whatever, or renewables, wherever we get our energy from. That is a story of our relationship with the environment, but it's also a story of alienation, and how we don't actually know where our light comes from. We flip a switch and we're alienated from the entire process that created that light, right? We buy into that system. Literally, we're purchasing the service, and it's super important. It's super relevant for us. And we owe so much to these Lucifers. But the reality is a brutal story of our abuse and misuse of land. And then finally, it's a story of capitalism, too. This book would fit very much into the new histories of capitalism, which, if you're not familiar with that, the new histories of capitalism, I think, back in the 70s and 80s, there was a lot of talk about capitalism, but they tended to come from these Marxist perspectives, or you'd have these like very enthusiastic, supportive, pro-capitalist kind of narratives. But it was kind of like a lot of the analysis of capitalism, to be honest, came from anti-capitalist Marxists, right? People who were trained in the Marxist tradition, historians, people like Boudel, maybe, with the world. He had kind of the global systems idea, Wallerstein. I can think of some other historians in other fields, like Arif Durlik, for instance, people who really were quite Marxist oriented. And then in the 90s and the early 2000s, you get this kind of global history turn. And then I think the history of capitalism becomes a bit muddled in many ways. Like, you have this very grandiose global vision. You have historians kind of searching out the global story, right? And so that leads them to look at institutions, leads them to look at things like you get books about the East India Company, or you get books about the global trade, or how trade, the world through 50 commodities. You get these kind of technical or these kind of institutional studies. You get kind of a glorification of the world market in a way as kind of the story of world history. And I don't want to be over reductive about the whole field of world history. I kind of grew up in that field. I'm just saying, in my perspective, that was it lacked a little the critical lens that you maybe got in the old Marxist traditions. But then the new history of capitalism that emerged, like what's that guy's name? The guy who wrote a book on Baltimore. Certainly, The Half Has Never Been Told, History of Slavery and American Capitalism. And books like this, they just look more at the reality of, they look at capitalism much more as like a lived system that evolves, I think. And it's just liberated. It's not less critical, it's just liberated from kind of the Marxist analytical framework. And it's also liberated from kind of that overly optimistic portrayal of kind of the unfolding of this massive world market. Instead, you get a lot of gritty. You see capitalism in every area of life, like all the way down to the ground, right, from the top of the system down to an enslaved person, selling stuff on the side, to entrepreneur enslavers, right? If you read The Half Has Never Been Told, which I'll get to probably shortly in this series. As I want to, because I do want to read more history in this. Eventually, I'll talk about that book because it is so amazing. That the enslavers were actually like capitalists, and they're innovators in their own perverted way. That were developing like this. They were in competitive markets, and they were developing like new strategies and things. That is all in this new history of capitalism. So, with Zallen, we have a mixture of all these things, right? And another thing I'd like to say about this book is this book is the closest I've seen that I remember in recent memory. I mean, I think The Half Has Never Been Told is maybe close to this, but this is even more so. Like a horror novel in a way. Like, there's body horror in this. There's some of like the hardest to read sections I've ever come across in reading history. And I've read a lot of Holocaust history, right? So to say that I'm not, and partially this is thanks to Zallen's prose and the way he delivers his story, right? Some readers may find it over the top maybe, but it's not like he doesn't have evidence that this is how it happens. It's just the way he constructs it and has things happening side by side. Like when he's talking about the camphine lamps, the piney light, he's got these women working long hours because of this light, this cheap light, right? They could work late at night to do piecework for the capitalists, making pennies for a shirt or whatever. And then this would be and then they would sometimes die or be horribly burned because this light was very dangerous. And this would be side by side to enslaved men being worked to death in the pine forest in the South, right? Producing the lamplight, right? And that juxtaposing, it's obvious, it's not contrived. I'm not saying it is. It's consciously put there to deepen the horror. And I think Zallen wants us to feel the horror of this. And I think that feeds into the title, right? Obviously, the straightforward reading is American Lucifers, The Dark History of Artificial Light. There's a lot of playful use of language here, the dark history of light, obviously. And then calling these workers Lucifers, Lucifer the light bringer, of course. But then you can't also read this without being aware of like Lucifer is the name of Satan, right? The cover itself has the top half, at least of the paperback version, has the top half with these technological marvels, these artificial lamps, these gas lamps, I think they are. And then underneath it, yes, these are the gas lamps on the top. And then you have the title, and underneath it you have a dark picture of, I think it's a coal mine. Yeah, I think it's the coal mine, and you see the production of the gas from the coal mines that would then feed into these technological marvels. And the book is literally light and dark. And I think that was a conscious choice of the author or the publisher, at least. And it's kind of amazing, right? I'd also say, like, the writing here is so much more impactful than when, like, I was getting my PhD in history. I think and the same thing with The Half Has Never Been Told by Edward Baptist. The use of language to talk about brutality, it's like we're beyond euphemisms. I'm remembering, I think it was Peter Wood who wrote an essay back in the 70s who said, we should stop saying plantations, we should stop saying slaves, we should say enslaved. Maybe I was part of it. But certainly I remember him saying we should be not saying plantations, we should call them like slave labor camps. And at the time, that was not picking up, right? Because it was, when I was in college, it was plantations. When I was in graduate school, it was plantations, right? But now you find more and more people like Zallen and like Edward Baptist calling them exactly what we should have always been calling them, slave labor camps or concentration camps, right? Or calling, and I'm thinking of slavery a lot because slavery is a big part of the story, right? A book about American history of 1750 to 1865 is intimately tied to the enslavement of millions of people, which is another, I think, wrench he throws into this overly technocratic kind of look at the history of light as just this unfolding of progress, right? This progressive narrative that everything here is contested. Every form of light is a contested power struggle between workers and capital, between even animals. I keep throwing in themes here, and I'm sorry for doing that, but there's just a lot to unpack here. Let me stay on the focus here on the language is, he's used, and I don't know if this is widespread across all historians now, but it was the kind of thing you couldn't get away with when I was in school, is using words like shit when talking about, pig shit, or talking about animals as if as resistance, like saying animals are engaged in resistance against the exploitation. All right, talking about pigs as if they have this almost human desire for liberty and survival, right? Maybe we don't want to go too far to say liberty, but they fought for their survival. They resisted the system. They became an annoyance for their enslavers, and that forced the enslavers to adapt their processes, right? So he creates, I'll get to this in the next episode more, this pigpen archipelago is what the author here calls it, which was a whole system for subduing the pigs so they could be transitioned to meat, other commodities, and lard oil, right, which would be used for a form of light too that was popular. So you had all these, or another example is, of course, the use of enslaver and enslaver or entrepreneur to talk about these so-called masters, and or how Edward Baptist uses the word fuck when talking about the rape of enslaved women, or the misuse of the land, or the misuse of these people, and the environment. That, I think, is needed, and I think that's refreshing in a way. And it's one thing I like about some of the new scholarship I've been reading is its very, very honest portrayal through the language. The being done with the equivocation, being done with the euphemisms of things, which still plagues so much of history, right? And I'd like to see more of that. I think, and maybe American historians are kind of being a pioneer here. because we so much, excuse me, us in the United States, of course I live in Taiwan, but I'm from the United States, but people who think a lot about the United States, coming to terms with the fact that this experiment in democracy might be over if it ever succeeded, right? And I think the most honest of us will admit that it never existed. It was always something that was aspirational and fought for and contested and ultimately defeated, right? Or ultimately seemingly to be defeated. That I can understand the lack of patience in this moment, in this generation, in this period, with the euphemisms for things, being polite about things, being polite about historical figures, right? Taking someone like Thomas Thistlewood, this enslaver, rapist in Jamaica, and just talking about him. He was a plantation owner, right? He was a master of men and nature. It's like, I think a lot of, especially maybe it's environmental history, is also got that honesty with our relationship with the nature. I like that. I'm just taking a long time to say I really appreciate the brutal honesty of some of the writing I've seen recently. And it's coming from, I don't know the words. I don't want to say leftist voices. I mean, this is obviously a leftist writer. But I still, I appreciate that we're done with this Marxist lingo and analysis, and we don't need to cite Das Kapital to understand this system or that system. And that lets us say it was capitalism down to the ground, right? From the global system, right? Because this book does not ignore the global system. It's not just a story of America. It's a story also of South America and children in London or in England making matches. It in some way becomes a global story. Not all the way, but quite a lot of it is. I think, what am I saying? Capitalism down to the ground, from the global system down to the interpersonal relationship between an enslaver and an enslaved person, or between someone on an assembly line carving up a hog, right? That is capitalism too, and those relationships exist, and they inform these people's decisions. So I don't know. Great book. So ultimately, we are talking here now. Zallen himself says it's a labor history, which is how he advertises the book to you as a reader. He says, not enough people do labor history, and as someone who has tried to do labor history, not as good as this, obviously. I really appreciate that too. I've thought for a long time we're due for a new labor history. The problem was how to write it, right? And that's what I always struggled with too. It's obviously we're not going to just write the history of unions anymore. That labor history has been told, and it's only a small fraction of the American working class. It's something Zallen points up here too, but it was something we knew in the early 2000s when we were trying to write labor history, is that the future can't be the Socialist Party, the history of the Socialist Party, the history of this labor union or that labor union. Not when private sector union rates in the United States are 6%, right? Not when you have a growing part of the working class being service workers and domestic servants and people working at Starbucks and tipped workers and things like that. That the working class is changed, its nature changed. And even in the past, to just focus on unionized workers and the union movement, labor movement, and politically active workers is ignoring most labor, right? Early labor history didn't really talk about slavery, for instance. Slavery was a separate genre, right? But when in fact enslaved people, I should say, worked in factories, they worked in industrial things, they worked in logging camps, they worked, of course, in these cotton slave labor camps, they worked on boats. They worked in all sorts of things, right? They were in construction. They were in clearing fields. And they were, part of the capitalist system, right? I guess Eric Williams wrote that book a long time ago on capitalism, slavery, but that was more slavery feeding capitalism, right? That because of slavery, you could have capitalism, the Industrial Revolution. And that's it, again, that's the Marxist, perspective. that informs that. Marx thought the same thing, right? That this kind of primitive accumulation comes from capital, right? Or the primitive accumulation comes from the exploitation of the New World, and that includes slavery. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. I've been teaching all morning, and I'm finding time to do this now. And my mind's a little cluttered, but I'll try to avoid those mistakes. Anyways, I'm saying what we do now, though, is we just again, once we can say it's capitalism down to the ground, we can include all this stuff in the story of labor history a lot more fluently without artificial breakups and compartmentalization of the story. And I think Zallen does that incredibly well in this book. In fact, I find it quite amazing that this was put together. And he does it without an overwhelming number of sources too, and I find that refreshing as well. Is sometimes historians, they load up the sources, and that makes the work itself a bit technocratic, and we're kind of copying this very clinical approach sometimes when we overload with sources. And Zallen here, I think, centers his story on people. And that sometimes means he has to be a little selective. Edward Baptist is the same thing, and I keep comparing these books in my head, partially because I read them recently close to each other, within like 5 or 6 months of each other. But both of them decide to go deeper into the human experience of things, and read sources, a little more deeper while building the context around them with other materials, rather than trying to be comprehensive. Right. Actually, quite a lot of this book is probably sources you could just find in Google Books. Right. A lot of digitized old books just exist. He even admits in his acknowledgments when he's thanking the contemporary Lucifers that a lot of this book was researched with his computer. Right. I obviously went to archives too, but when you look up a footnote and you're like, where did you get that from? A lot of it are just books that seem fairly accessible. I'm not saying I went through all of them, but I got a sense that this is a story that could always have been told, but wasn't being told. We don't get numbers. We don't get, pound, barrel. We get some of that. We get told how many barrels of oil come from a sperm whale, for instance, but we don't get that kind of brutal economic analysis, right, of demand and supply and this much output and this tariff or that kind of thing, which I think kind of burdened a lot of the world historical writing at times, right, where you'd get these books, especially in the 90s, I've noticed this a lot, where there'd be these big overarching global histories of capitalism or the world system or of global trade, and no one's mentioned. There's no people there. It's just these systems. And we're in history because we write history, we read history because we want to know more we want to feel these people's lives. And Zallen does that. I think he does a really great job of making us feel people's lives. And that's how he starts the book. In the prologue of this book, let me try to get into the first actual 100 pages of this, maybe the first, the first 2-3 chapters. I'll briefly go over so you can get a sense of what's in here. In the prologue, though, he kind of sets up all his themes pretty well here. There's a lot in here. I think if you just read this, it's just 12 pages. It sums up so much of the book. But it starts with this very, very human experience of someone we all know. Again, everyone trained as a historian knows Martha Ballard. If we haven't read her diary or parts of her diary, we've read The Midwife's Tale, right? In fact, let me check a footnote. Yeah, so he does cite Ulrich's book on Martha Ballard, but the diary's online. Martha Ballard's diary online, so it's been digitized. So thanks to whoever digitized that. So there's no this story in the life of Martha Ballard. Probably a lot of us have just come across as we were writing history or thinking about history, but he brings it alive much better, I think, than Ulrich does in her book, although she's focused on other things. But it's a short little passage here about her making candles. And with her daughter, like that, the story is she was a midwife, so she got a call and she had to deliver a baby, and it took all night, and she came back home, and then she had to make candles. And you made candles with lard, right? Processed from the animals that were slaughtered on the farm, right? Ballard was a main farm wife and midwife, so it was like was it beef tallow or whatever? But she made dozens and dozens of these candles by dipping it again and again, the candles again and again, in this boiling tallow mixture, burning her hands, getting the blowback from the burning oil. You know, you maybe made candles. I'm sure I did. I have some memory of making candles where you just use the wax, right, the beeswax or whatever, and you just dip it a few times. Imagine doing that with a boiling pot of tallow, right? And you know how oil is when it's boiling. So it feels so real when you get that story of just the drudgery and the misery of it all, right? That's why I said this is pretty much the closest I've gotten to a horror book in reading history in a long time, and I think that's to praise of the book. So then he contrasts this, though, and he does this a lot in the book, and I think it's really, really effective here. Contrast that to like mines in Potosi, Peruvian mines, also using tallow candles, in semi-enslaved Native Americans in Potosi working in these shifts, so they're working all night and they needed the lamplight. We get mentions of, then he kind of moves into his theme of his book anyways, which is this technological narrative he's trying to grapple with, this determinism, I guess, this technological determinism that humanity emerged in darkness, grew up in darkness, and then in the 19th century mastered nature and brought light to the darkness, lit the day, and he mentions actually Senator Platt talking about electrical light in this way. I didn't know about this speech or this focus Platt had on light, but apparently he wrote this thing, made this declaration or whatever, and he said, like, electricity is this victory of God over nature, right? And Zallen's saying this is so limiting to look at it this way, right? First of all, the entire story of light is a battle between humanity and nature in some way, right? That we're constantly struggling with extracting light from the basic sinews and materials of existence of light, whether it's murdering sperm whales by the thousands, almost driving them to extinction, to create 200 barrels or whatever it was of oil to be sold, in the high quality markets, or it was pine trees being tapped and people being worked to death to create the camphene oil, or what was done to pigs. I mean, I'll talk about this in the next episode, but it's like so, that chapter is so amazing to read when you actually almost in that chapter, you feel what it was like to be a pig and have your life transformed into commodities, right? This guy must have studied with Cronin, right? Because he almost uses some of the same language as Cronin's Dangerous Metropolis and this, like, from land to commodities kind of narration. I think he actually did. I think he mentions William Cronin in the acknowledgments or in the introduction or something. So he mentions that he's kind of challenging this narrative of this kind of just progressive overcoming of nature, and that somehow electricity is this turning point from the Dark Ages to the modern age, right? And that there's all these other contested forms of light in the early 19th century. And then he says, well, I'm actually writing a labor history, right? Because it's American Lucifers. It's not American light. It's the people who created light with their lives, their sacrifice, their struggle, day to day, just to get through existence, right? Everything from these kids who had rotting jaws because of the phosphorus to these people selling matches for pennies. And then we'll get to matches later on, too, because there's an interesting side story in the whole match section, too, that Zallen brings up, to the sailors and things like that. So anyway, it's a prologue, super, super effective. Then we get to chapter 1, dragged up hither from the bottom of the sea. And if you're like me, if you're a Melville guy, remember this podcast actually began with Melville, what is it, almost 8 years ago now? This chapter is about whaling, and it's a labor history of whaling. And again, as someone who even wrote some history about the sea, again, not as effectively as this. I mean, this guy is so good at just describing the work process on the ship, how the whales were captured and how they were dissected, how they were processed, the whole collective nature of that. I mean, that's another actually theme I didn't even bring up yet, and I really should, is like this book is probably, if you're dealing with someone who's like a hyper individualist, someone who thinks the economy is driven by individual entrepreneurs or thinks that the individual is the center of economic activity, and this should be the center of our analysis, and our conception of freedom is rooted in individual. If you have one of those people, if they still exist, I guess libertarian types, I mean, this book is just a slam dunk argument against that, everything is this collective labor process, and nature's part of that. Nature's labor is created, like the sperm whale comes out of its own process with its own work, in a way, if you want to call it that, getting bigger, right? Surviving, living its life. And through that, it becomes something that can become a commodity, right? And so much of nature is that. You especially get this in the pig chapter, where the pig's job are like enslaved to a job, which is to fatten up and die. Like that is the point of their existence that's been created for them by human beings. But anyways, this chapter, a lot of good Melville stuff, a lot of good on whaling. It's not particularly new for me, but it's just super, super well told, I think. And I don't know, maybe I should read a passage just to give you a sense of when I talk about how amazing the prose is here. There's so many examples of it, but I'm just impressed. There's nothing clinical about it. Everything is a very honest and direct. Quote, to quote a section, this is page 41, whale ships were massive tools designed to transform whales into oil that could be sold as a commodity. They carried sailors and whaleboats, housed try-works and tackles, stored barrels, food, and livestock, and thereby made it possible to translate and transport living whale fat from the Pacific into the barrels of whale oil on New England docks. They were the social mouths and stomachs that provided nourishment for the flames of oil lamps thousands of miles away. Following the first kill, over the next 3 years, the crew of the Maria would repeat the process of catching, cutting, trying out, and storing below 36 more times. Some days, they caught as many as 4 whales before they began cutting in. By voyage's end, the Maria's assemblage of men, boats, harpoons, spades, tackles, hooks, tie works, barrels, and holds would consume its storage, a total of 52 whales. And the whole story, like I said before, he doesn't have to read 50 log books of different whaling ships. He focuses on one whale ship, the Maria, and one voyage. 1 3-year or so voyage through the Pacific. And that's all you have to do. Because when you're doing labor history, it's like that story is replicated for every whale ship, right? The whale ships that made it, the whale ships that didn't. This was the story, whether it's the Bounty or this one that did go back and was able to sell its goods. Anyways, beautiful stuff. Chapter 2 is chapter 2, and I think chapter 4 are chapter 2 and 4 are my favorites in this book. Chapter 1 is great, but it's kind of too close to my own kind of work for me to be as detached and amazed by what I read. But 2 is like all new to me. Chapter 2, Piney Lights, is about, I think it's pronounced camphene, which is these turpentine, cheap working class light produced by turpentine. Now imagine that, like you're lighting your home with a concoction. Essentially, it's just turpentine. I mean, what was it, the scene in the lighthouse where they run out of liquor and they start drinking turpentine mixed with honey? It's just like, it's horrible stuff, and it stinks, and it's super dangerous. And he mentions here, Zallen mentions thousands of women, mostly young women, because they were the ones who'd be doing the pierced work that night that needed this light and couldn't afford better forms of light, or more high quality or safer forms of light. They were being burned to death or seriously injured by this on a pretty regular basis, right? All to keep the textile industry going. And again, when we think about the industrial history, the labor history of textiles, so much of our focus, we kind of get into this narrative in our heads. And certainly we probably teach this. That, there was homework, people made clothes at home. And then along came piecework, in rural England where you'd sell wool to someone and they would make thread, and then you'd give that thread to someone else and they'd weave it, and then they'd take that cloth to someone else and they'd sew it up, and you'd have this. And then some entrepreneur gets the idea, let's just put this all in one building near a river, we'll power it with water power. And later on someone says, well, why can't we power it with electricity? Okay, there. And then we have textile mills. That's the story we sometimes tell, right? But no, alongside the little mills were these women working late nights. It wasn't like one then the other. It was, these were coexisting systems of oppression. And this one was in some ways worse because, this wasn't shift work. They were being paid piece rates. So there was an incentive for these people to work themselves to death, to work late into the night, to work in even dangerous conditions, right? There was less accountability because they were like private contractors, right? It's kind of like what we have now with like so many private contractors working there. It's a way to export the risk for the company, right? You don't have to worry about, Uber doesn't have to worry about the safety because of the passengers and the drivers, because those are just contractors, right? Anyways, Piney Lights, just all new to me. That's a long way of saying this was all new to me and wonderful. I didn't even really know about this system of light at all. Maybe that's just my own ignorance, but we can't know everything, right? But he ties that to the history of enslavement in America and how slavery in the East, as we know, this is again the traditional narrative, is that slavery in Virginia and Maryland was was becoming less economically viable. At the same time that it became super viable and profitable in the West and in the Southwest in particular. So you have the domestic slave trade. None of that didn't happen, obviously. That obviously did happen, but clever entrepreneur enslavers figured out ways to use the caffeine boom, the desire for light in the North, in these kind of quasi-factory settings, these homes turned into factories, that they took these enslaved workers and put them into work with these pine trees, right? With this pine making the turpentine, right? Which not only involved working in the forest, it also involved like big vats and boiling and all kinds of danger there, and that these two very dangerous systems coexisted. I think this is very, very well told. And another theme in the book that he brings up a lot is the contested nature of these different forms of light and these different systems that sustain them. And it comes up here more strong in this chapter than I think in the one on sperm oil. Sperm whale oil is the fact that this was kind of the very first consumer safety movement in a way. It comes out of this, where people started to say, like, this is just too dangerous. We got to ban this. Right, we got to ban the caffeine lamps because they're killing people. Right, not necessarily getting down again to the ground of capitalism's exploitative nature from the top, from the system all the way down to the slave labor camps. But nevertheless, the noticing at the consumer level that this is a dangerous commodity. How often does that happen? Like, we know consumers, we care about consumer safety, worker safety if we're alienated from it. Sorry to use some Marxist language there, but I think it's still a relevant concept. The alienated labor far away is not our concern, right? Right? If chocolate caused cancer, there'd be a big movement to have warning labels and all that, or cigarettes for that matter, right? We all know cigarettes are bad for us. How much can say anything about the labor process that goes into growing tobacco and making cigarettes? And is that safe, right? We know red meat's bad for us, but how many of us know what it's like in a meat packing plant? I think Zallen works his way through that really, really well. So anyways, beautiful chapter. I'll read another passage just because he's so good. Quote, turpentine camps were living ecologies that enslavers forced onto being and coerced into survival until each of the camps grew old and died. But as they were living, they could also be reproduced. An ecologically complex that began in North Carolina, turpentine camps spread rapidly across the pine belts in the 1850s, driven overwhelmingly by tar heels, long steeped in the industry. Decades of intense production had so damaged and stressed the ecology of North Carolina's piney woods that on the eve of the Civil War, few pine strands remained. Boxing did much of the damage, first by seriously injuring the trees and second by spraying flammable wood chips around the forest floor. The fires and insects that tore through the strands of the wounded working pines were bad enough, but it was an abandoned turpentine forest, the ones that scarred to the limit the production and human reach, that caused the most damage. The tall, slave-wrought faces of hardened resin were like accelerants waiting to be ignited. This confluence of death and fire led to what one historian termed turpentine's suicidal harvest on the move. End quote. So, again, another great example. And then chapter 3, the last one I'll just briefly mention about. This one I was a little less like up to facing, in part because it was not quite, it was pretty new to me too, but for whatever reason it didn't impact me as much as the Piney Light chapter. But this one is about, it's got a great title though, Dungeons and Dragons and Gaslights. So if you've ever wanted Dungeons and Dragons to show up in your history book, that's not about the history of Dungeons and Dragons. This is the first I've ever seen, but it all fits thematically. So this is the oil gas lamps, right? This is that technology, the so-called safety lamps, right? But this, of course, is tied to a whole nother extractive process, and that is the coal mining, right? And out of that, this is kind of a byproduct of the coal mines. And this chapter kind of gets a little bit more into the class struggle in the mines. And of course, we know from labor history that the coal miners were kind of on the vanguard of a lot of early labor movement. So it makes sense that this would be a chapter that would talk about a more organized kind of class struggle kind of narrative, which we don't really get in the other chapter because it's just, there doesn't seem to be as much space for resistance in the Piney Light chapter. I mean, there's some here, obviously, but everything is like it's so horrific. You're talking about enslaved people who didn't have as much space to resist, although he does get into some of the resistance of enslaved people there, but it's a little bit more formalized. Resistance is more formalized here. We also get the role of urban developers and the middle class who benefited a lot from this form of light. The corporations, there's a lot of class solidarity among the relative elite in these cities and how they collaborated to ensure the maximum profitability of this form of that. And essentially the story is that the liberal classes of the cities, thinking of this actually is an important chapter to read. It maybe didn't move me as much as the other one, but it's super important for his overall argument, is how the middle classes, the liberal city at one point he calls it, was basically commodifying the working class and the land around it, the land that this coal came from, fucking it, as Edward Baptist would say, for the benefits that came from this gas light, right? And there was kind of a political and class war element to it, and I think this chapter does a good job of talking about it. So, we got, in these 3 chapters, we kind of got 3 different stories of light. One is kind of a global story of the extraction of sperm whale oil which is, of course, one we're at least most familiar with. He starts probably with the story we're most familiar with. Who doesn't know about, sperm whale oil lamps? But it's a global story. It's the high-end, high-quality, expensive stuff. But it's a story we know. We've read Moby Dick, right? We know this story pretty well. But we're reminded of it, of the labor processes and things like that. Then we get this, like, what for most people I think would be a really new story of the caffeine light. And it's how it transcended the sectional barriers, right? And how capitalism really ran from top to bottom, from the whole production process, from the consumer down to from the producer to the consumer, right? From the slaves, from the enslaved people to the victimized consumers of this cheap, dangerous product. And then in the Dungeons and Dragons and Gaslights, we get this political story of like a class war won by the ruling class, the middle classes and the elite classes, the corporate, the corporation owners and things like that, to regularize this form of light, right? And we expect that's kind of a story that's going to be repeated with electricity at some time too, right? Isn't that part of the story of Edison too? Is the backroom dealing and the patent office stuff? That's part of the story too of light that adds to the labor story. So, anyways, I think we can finish up our thoughts about Zallen in one more episode, where we'll talk about the Pigpen Archipelago, which is about pigs and lard light. Then we'll do a chapter on Lucifer matches, which was actually the brand name. So you get kind of this consumer brand name introduced predominantly in here, which is the matches. But then we have the whole story of phosphorus, which is a global story, from South America to England, to the consumers in America, to enslaved people resisting enslavement using something as simple as a match. It's kind of elegant in a way. Then we'll get oil and the movement to kerosene and the impact of the Civil War in Chapter 6, because Zallen really thinks the Civil War is a major turning point in this whole story, and one in which, while industrial slavery is defeated, right, and that throws a wrench into a lot of these systems, of course, that's going to be part of the issue, right? A lot of this is sustained by the heavily exploitive nature of enslavement, right, of that whole system. So anyways, that's my thoughts on the first half of American Lucifers, The Dark History of Artificial Light by Jeremy Zallen. One of the best history books I've read, and I really encourage you to find it, to buy a copy. It is a work of literature. It's not just a work of historical scholarship. So anyways, that's that. I'll see you next time. I'll finish up with the book next time. It's nice to be back. I had a hard time kind of getting back into this to think about how to do it, and I hope you can appreciate me, just like I said in the last episode when I announced my new approach, just me being me. I don't want to force myself to read things just to read them. I don't want to force myself to read every work by someone like... Anyways, I just hope you can appreciate that, by letting me be me, or by myself letting myself be me. Obviously, you guys weren't telling me to do anything, but I hope it can be more enjoyable for everybody, and maybe we all can learn more that way. So yeah, expect less literature, but expect more reflection on what I'm thinking about day to day. Right? I think that's going to be more peaceful for myself. And, if you're here for the literature, it's not going away entirely, but we'll if you still have recommendations, let me know. Maybe I'll be more open to recommendations at this point. But I'm going to try harder to be a little more chill in how I go at it, and let myself just enjoy what I enjoy. And right now, I'm really enjoying reading history. So, anyways, I hope that can still be a contribution to the overall discussion of books and literature and reading and writing on the internet. So, anyways, thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.